The Galactic Coalition base on Outpost Theta 7 was a marvel of interspecies cooperation. 17 different species worked side by side, their various physiologies and cultural norms creating a tapestry of controlled chaos. But nothing in the extensive diplomatic protocols prepared anyone for humans, especially not Kira. Commander Vexillar of the Corinthian Dominion watched through his observation window as the human engineer moved through the maintenance bay with that peculiar grace her species possessed. Kira was compact by human standards, barely 5.5 feet tall, but she moved with an efficiency that belied her world's gravitational disadvantage. Her dark hair was pulled back in what she called a ponytail, and her hands worked with precision on the fusion regulator that had stumped 3 senior technicians. "Remarkable," Vexler chittered to his second-in-command. "She fixed it in 17 minutes. What Vexler didn't see was the small delegation forming 3 corridors away. Rovik crouched low, his silver-striped tail twitching with determination. At barely 6 months old, he was one of 12 Corinthian cubs currently residing on the base, offspring of diplomatic staff who'd been deemed too young for the Crest ships. His amber eyes fixed on the doorway to Kira's quarters with predatory focus. "Are you certain this is wise?" whispered Shira, her smaller frame tucked behind him. "The soft thing calls to us," Rovik replied, his translator collar rendering his juvenile growls into understandable speech. "I have observed the human. She uses it for sleeping. It makes her calm." 3 other cubs emerged from the shadows, Tavik, Mara, and little Kex, who was barely old enough to walk on all 4s properly. They had been watching Kira for weeks now, studying her routines with the intensity their species was known for. Humans were fascinating. Humans were warm. And most importantly, humans didn't recoil when the cubs approached. The other species on the base had been less welcoming. The Iridians hissed and erected their spine frills. The Peltharians complained about dangerous predators roaming freely. Even their own adult Corinthians often shooed them away from important areas. But Kira? Kira had smiled. She'd crouched down to their level and let them sniff her hands. She'd even scratched behind Rovik's ears in that spot that made his back leg kick involuntarily. And when she slept, they'd seen through the observation ports, she curled around a large, soft object that looked like heaven incarnate. "The door is unlocked," Rovik announced after testing the panel. "Humans are trusting creatures." They slipped inside. Kira's quarters were modest but personalized. Images of Earth decorated one wall. Vast forests, something called an ocean, and creatures the cubs recognized as fellow predators: wolves, tigers, bears. But their attention zeroed in on the bed, where a massive blue pillow sat propped against the wall. It was perfect. It was glorious. It smelled like Kira, that unique human scent of salt and warmth, and something inexplicably comforting. "We take it," Rovik declared. What followed was a logistical nightmare that would have impressed military strategists across 3 sectors. The pillow was large, designed for human proportions, and the cubs were small. Rovik took point, his jaws clamping onto one corner. Tavik and Mara grabbed the sides while Shira pushed from behind. Little Kex, eager to help, mostly got in the way and occasionally tumbled over his own paws. They dragged it through the doorway, leaving a trail of scattered personal items and one overturned plant. Into the corridor they went, their prize sliding across the polished floor with surprising resistance. "Heavy!" Mara grunted around her mouthful of fabric. "Worthy treasures always are," Rovik replied philosophically. They encountered their first obstacle at Junction 4B, where Lieutenant Zathen of the Peltharian delegation nearly jumped 3 feet in the air. "What in the 17 hells?" The avian officer's feathers puffed in alarm. "Is that the human's pillow?" Rovik paused, fixing Zathen with his most intimidating stare, which, given his age, was more adorable than threatening. "Yes, we require it. You can't just... The human will..." Zathen's translator struggled with his sputtering. "This is theft. This is necessity," Rovik countered, resuming his march. The other cubs followed, dragging the pillow around Zathen's legs while the lieutenant squawked protests that went thoroughly ignored. Word spread quickly through the base. By the time the cubs reached the main concourse, a small crowd had gathered. Engineers paused their work. Diplomats emerged from conference rooms. Someone was recording. Through it all, 5 determined cubs hauled their prize toward the observation deck, a quiet area with wide windows overlooking the purple nebula that gave Theta 7 its spectacular views. It was where the cubs often gathered when the adult activities grew too boring or the other species too unwelcoming. They arranged the pillow in a spot of artificial sunlight streaming through the viewport. Rovik circled it 3 times before flopping down with a satisfied rumble. The others quickly followed, creating a pile of striped fur and contentment. Perfect, Shira purred. That was how Kira found them an hour later. She stood in the doorway of the observation deck, hands on her hips, surrounded by at least a dozen base personnel who'd come to witness the resolution of what was already being called the Great Pillow Heist. Her expression was unreadable. The cubs tensed. Rovik's ears flattened slightly, but he maintained his position atop the pillow, ready to defend their claim. Kira stepped forward. The crowd held its breath. She sat down cross-legged beside the pillow pile, reached out, and began scratching Rovik behind the ears. His back leg immediately started kicking. "You know," she said softly, "you could have just asked." "Humans share their soft things?" Rovik asked, his translator rendering his surprise trill. "Humans share lots of things." Kira smiled, that strange human expression that showed teeth but somehow wasn't threatening. "Especially with friends." She settled in beside them and the cubs immediately swarmed, creating a new configuration with Kira at the center. Her warmth radiated through their fur. Her heartbeat, that steady, reliable rhythm, thrummed beneath their ears. Commander Vexlar watched from the crowd, his mandibles clicking in what might have been amusement. Extraordinary, indeed. While the galaxy had spent centuries fearing humanity's capacity for violence, their tenacity in war, their stubborn refusal to yield, no one had quite anticipated their capacity for this, for acceptance, for warmth, for becoming a pillow pile's honored centerpiece without question. By the time the base's night cycle began, Kira hadn't moved. 5 cubs snoozed peacefully around her, their breathing synchronized, their claws carefully retracted. And in her quarters, her bed sat empty. She never did get that pillow back.